The emergency room was full of witnesses. 32 nurses, doctors, and technicians watched in complete silence as security guards escorted Claire Whitmore through the double doors she had walked through every morning for 4 years. Her scrubs still had blood on them, a patient's blood, from a man she had just pulled back from the edge of something irreversible. She was still wearing her stethoscope. Nobody told her to take it off. Nobody said anything at all. Dr. Marcus Vell stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed and his jaw set, like he'd already rehearsed this moment, and when Claire passed within 3 feet of him, he didn't blink. That was the part that stayed with people afterward, not the handcuffs they expected, but never came, not the paperwork, the fact that he didn't blink. Before we go any further, if you're watching this story for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens to Claire Whitmore across these 5 parts is the kind of story you do not want to walk into at part 3 without knowing where it started. Like this video, leave a comment below telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. People watching from Lagos to Los Angeles, from Hanoi to Houston, drop your location and let's find out together. Now, let's go back to that emergency room, because what nobody in that room understood yet was that the quietest person they had ever dismissed was about to become the most dangerous witness they had ever made. The shift had started the way most bad ones did, not with a single catastrophic moment, but with a series of small things that felt wrong in ways Claire Whitmore couldn't immediately name. The first was the chart. She'd picked it up at 6:50 in the morning, 13 minutes before the official start of her shift, because that was how she worked. She liked to know what she was walking into before the noise of handover made it harder to think. Room 7, the chart said. Male patient, 54 years old, admitted the previous evening with what the overnight notes described as hypertensive urgency and mild cardiac arrhythmia. Stable, responsive, scheduled for a follow-up echo and potential discharge pending attending review. Claire read it twice. Then she walked down the hall, past the supply alcove where the overnight tech was restocking saline bags, past the whiteboard where the charge nurse had already mapped the morning assignments, and she stepped into room 7 and looked at the man in the bed. He was not stable. His lips had a faint grayish cast that the fluorescent lighting made worse but didn't create. His respiratory rate was too high for a resting adult. She counted it without a watch, a habit she'd built in another life entirely. And when she checked his fingernails, the capillary refill was sluggish in a way that suggested something systemic, something the chart had either missed or chosen not to mention. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'm Claire. I'll be your nurse today. How are you feeling?" The man opened his eyes. They were brown, slightly glassy, and when he focused on her, she had the odd impression he was deciding something. "Tired," he said, "like I've been tired for a long time." "Any chest tightness? Pressure anywhere?" A pause. "Some." "Since when?" "Few hours." He shifted, winced. "The doctor last night said it was the blood pressure, that it would settle." Claire didn't say what she was thinking. She smiled, told him she was going to take his vitals and check a few things, and spent the next 9 minutes doing exactly that. His blood pressure was elevated, but not critically so. That part of the chart was accurate. But his oxygen saturation was sitting at 93% on room air, which the overnight notes had recorded as 98. And when she put her stethoscope to his chest, she heard something that made her go still for exactly 2 seconds before she straightened and pulled out her phone. She needed to flag this to the attending. The attending on for the morning was Dr. Marcus Vell. This was not the first time their paths had crossed, and it was not the first time Claire had needed to reach him about something that couldn't wait. She'd been a nurse at Hargrove Memorial Hospital in Salt Lake City for 4 years. Vell had been on staff for 9. The distance between those numbers was something he communicated without ever saying it directly, in the way he turned slightly when she spoke in morning rounds, in the way he answered her clinical questions with the verbal equivalent of a form letter, technically responsive but completely disengaged. She called his extension. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called the charge nurse instead. Dana Marsh, who had been a good nurse once and was now mostly a person who managed up very effectively and managed down with selective attention. "I need someone to look at the patient in room 7, Claire said. "The overnight notes don't match what I'm seeing." "Vell's already been notified about that patient," Dana said. "He reviewed the chart remotely last night." "Remotely. He'll do rounds at 8. That's 55 minutes from now. This patient needs Claire. Dana's voice had that particular texture it got when she was about to say something she considered final. Dr. Vell reviewed the chart. If you have concerns, document them and flag them when he comes in. Claire documented them. She also didn't wait. She went back to room 7, repositioned the patient slightly to improve his respiratory mechanics, got him on supplemental oxygen via nasal cannula, 2 liters, which she could initiate per standing protocol, and watched his saturation climb back toward 96. She checked his IV access, verified the line was patent, and then sat in the chair beside his bed for 3 minutes because she needed to think and he needed to not feel alone. "You're worried," the man said. "I'm thorough," she said. He almost smiled. "There's a difference." "Sometimes." His name, according to the chart, was Robert Halden. Occupation listed as consultant. Emergency contact was a woman named Patricia. Relationship listed as wife. And below that, a secondary contact with a work number and no name, just an agency code she didn't recognize. She'd seen government agency codes before. Not often, and never in this hospital, but she recognized the format. She noted it, filed it away, said nothing. At 7:40, Dr. Marcus Vell walked into the ER with his badge slightly crooked and his coffee in his left hand, and Claire intercepted him before he reached the nurse's station. "Room 7, she said. "Halden. The overnight notes have him at 98% on room air. He was at 93 when I came in. I've got him on 2 liters. His lung sounds are concerning. Possible early pulmonary edema, though I want your read on it." Vell looked at her over his coffee. I was 47, broad-shouldered in the way that Reed is authority in certain rooms, and he had a particular expression he used for Claire specifically. Not contemptuous exactly, more like mildly fatigued, as though she were a recurring administrative inconvenience rather than a colleague. "I reviewed that chart last night," he said. "I know, but what I'm seeing this morning is different from what the chart says. You've been here 40 minutes, 43, and his capillary refill is sluggish, his respiratory rate is elevated, and there's something in his lower left lobe that I'd like you to listen to." A pause. Vell took a sip of his coffee. "I'll get him during rounds. That's in 15 minutes. Then you can wait 15 minutes. He moved past her. Claire stood where she was for a moment, then turned and went back to room 7. Robert Halden was watching the ceiling. "The doctor coming?" he asked. "Soon," she said. "You don't look convinced." "I look professional," she said. "There's a difference." He laughed, which was the wrong thing for his respiratory status, and she watched him carefully until it subsided. Then he said quietly, "I know what's in those notes aren't right." She looked at him. "I mean the ones from last night," he said, "when they brought me in. The doctor who saw me. I don't know his name, young guy, glasses. He asked me a lot of questions that didn't seem like they were about my blood pressure. And then he spent a long time on his computer, more time than the exam." Claire kept her expression neutral. "What kind of questions?" "About my work, where I'd been recently, whether I'd been in contact with anyone at a federal office." A pause. "I told him it was none of his business. He didn't seem to like that." She stayed another 6 minutes. She checked his vitals again, verified the oxygen was helping, made sure his call button was within reach. Then she went to the nurse's station and pulled up the overnight documentation for room 7 with the kind of methodical focus she'd learned in a context that had nothing to do with hospitals. What she found was not dramatic. That was the thing about documentation fraud. It never announced itself. It just sat there, internally consistent, unremarkable, designed to be skimmed rather than read. The overnight notes on Robert Halden were technically complete. They referenced the correct vital parameters for a patient with his admitting diagnosis. They used the right language. They cited the right clinical criteria for the decision to defer further workup until morning. But the time-stamped vitals didn't sequence correctly. The 920 entry had a respiratory rate that was lower than the 905 entry, which would be consistent with improvement, except the medication administered at 915 wouldn't have acted that quickly. And the notation on his oxygen saturation had a decimal point irregularity so small most people would blink past it. Claire didn't blink past things. She pulled up the medication administration record, cross-referenced it with the pharmacy log, found a discrepancy in the dosage timing that was small enough to be a clerical error and specific enough that it probably wasn't. She was still looking at it when Dana Marsh appeared at her elbow. "What are you doing?" Dana asked. "Chart review." That's not your patient load this morning. You've got 4, 7, 12, and 15. 7 is on my list. The overnight documentation on 7 is complete. Claire turned. Dana was 41, competent in ways that had calcified into a particular kind of institutional loyalty, and right now her expression had moved past its usual managed neutrality into something closer to actual concern. Though whether that concern was for the patient or for something else, Claire couldn't immediately determine. The overnight documentation on 7 has a saturation reading that doesn't match what I observed at 6:53, Claire said. I want to understand why. Sometimes equipment reads differently between shifts. Not usually by 5 points. A silence. Claire, Dana's voice had dropped. Just do your rounds. Dr. Vell is going to see that patient. Let him do his job. I'm doing mine. Dana left. Claire printed 2 pages of the documentation, folded them, and put them in the pocket of her scrubs. Then she went to see her other patients, because she had 4 of them, and they needed her, and she was still, regardless of everything else, here to take care of sick people. By 8:20, Dr. Vell had rounded on room 7. Claire was in room 12 when it happened, a 60-year-old woman named Sandra Bear with a hip fracture who kept trying to get out of bed unaided and required the kind of patient presence that didn't allow for divided attention. She heard about it secondhand from an ER tech named Priya who came by looking for a blood pressure cuff and mentioned it in passing. Vell discharged the guy in 7, Priya said. Claire looked up. Halden? Yeah, said he was stable enough for outpatient follow-up. He was on supplemental oxygen 40 minutes ago. Priya shrugged the way people shrugged when they were uncomfortable and didn't want to be. I don't know. That's what I heard. Claire finished what she was doing for Sandra Bear, raised her call rail, confirmed her pain medication timing, made sure she understood why she couldn't swing her legs over the side of the bed unassisted, and then walked directly to room 7. Robert Halden was sitting on the edge of the bed in street clothes, tying his shoe. The oxygen cannula was on the mattress. The monitoring leads had been removed. A discharge summary was folded on the bedside table, and he was picking it up as she walked in. They're letting me go, he said. I know. She stopped inside the doorway. How are you feeling? Better than earlier. They gave me something, IV medication. The nurse who did it said it was for the arrhythmia. Which medication? He looked at the discharge summary. Read off the name. Claire's chest went tight. The medication he named was not indicated for his admitting diagnosis. It was a legitimate cardiac drug. She wasn't going to find it on a banned list. But the clinical reasoning for administering it to this patient, with this presentation, at this stage, was not something she could construct even if she tried. She crossed the room and looked at the discharge summary herself. The drug was listed. The indication was listed. The indication, however, referenced a finding that wasn't in the overnight notes or the morning notes, a finding that would have required a specific test to confirm, a test she saw no record of having been ordered. Mr. Halden, she said quietly, I need to ask you something. Okay. Has anything unusual happened to you in the last 2 weeks? Anything that made you concerned enough to reach out to someone? Professionally, I mean. He went very still. I can't talk about that here, he said. I'm not asking you to. I just need to know whether the reason you came in last night had anything to do with something you were working on. A pause that lasted about 4 seconds, which was a long pause for a man who seemed to Claire like someone practiced at giving nothing away. Be careful, he said. The people who change those notes, they're not just protecting themselves from a malpractice claim. He picked up his jacket. I've got someone coming to get me. I'll be okay. A beat. You should be more careful than I was. He left. Claire stood in the empty room for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and photographed the discharge summary before housekeeping could come in and the paperwork could disappear into the normal bureaucratic flow of a busy hospital. She photographed both pages. Then she went back to the nurse's station, sat down, and started writing her own formal incident report. Not the soft, hedge-everything version she might have written 2 hours ago, but a specific, time-stamped, clinically detailed account of every discrepancy she had found, every number that didn't align, every documentation irregularity she could identify. She was on page 2 when she heard the PA system overhead. Charge nurse to the administrative wing. Charge nurse to administrative. She kept writing. 10 minutes later, Dana Marsh came back to the station looking like she'd been told something she hadn't wanted to hear. She stopped beside Claire's workstation, and she didn't say anything for a moment. "There's a meeting," Dana said finally. "Administration wants to see you." "I'm in the middle of an incident report." "They know." Claire saved her work, made sure it was submitted into the system rather than sitting in a local draft where it could be pulled, and then stood up and followed Dana. The administrative wing of Hargrove Memorial was quieter than the ER in the way that carpeted hallways were always quieter. The sound absorbed, the sense of urgency dampened, the whole atmosphere pitched toward the kind of controlled institutional seriousness that was designed to make you feel small without doing anything overtly hostile. Claire had been in this hallway before. She'd reported a medication error 2 years ago that had eventually led to a policy change. She'd raised a concern about a staffing ratio 18 months ago that had gone exactly nowhere. Each time, the administration had thanked her for her diligence and then done with her concerns exactly what they chose. The conference room held 4 people. Dr. Marcus Vell, standing near the window with his arms crossed. Dana Marsh, who had come in behind Claire and taken a position near the door that was either coincidental or deliberate. Gerald Preem, the hospital's chief operating officer, who Claire had met twice in 4 years, and who had a very precise way of sitting that suggested every element of his posture was managed, and a man she didn't recognize. 50s, well-dressed in a way that was just slightly too deliberate, with the kind of physical stillness that Claire associated with people who had spent significant time in environments where inattention had costs. "Sit down, Claire," Gerald Preem said. She sat. "We're here," he said, "to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your conduct this morning." She looked at him. "I've just submitted an incident report about documentation discrepancies in room 7. I'd like that to be on record before this conversation proceeds." A brief silence. "Your incident report," Vell said, "describes conclusions you're not qualified to draw." "I'm qualified to identify when a saturation reading doesn't match what I observed." "You observed one reading at one time on a patient with a dynamic presentation. That's not a discrepancy. That's medicine." "The medication administered to Mr. Halden this morning wasn't indicated for his documented presentation. I made a clinical determination, based on a test result I can't find in his chart." The silence that followed that was different from the previous ones. Claire felt it. The way the temperature in the room didn't change, but the attention did. The man she didn't recognize shifted very slightly. Preem placed both hands flat on the table. "Claire," Preem said, "we've received reports that you've been reviewing patient charts outside your assigned caseload, that you've been asking staff questions about documentation, that you've been—" a pause. "Creating an atmosphere of concern that's affecting unit morale." "I've been doing my job." "You've been overstepping." "I found a patient whose discharge was—" "The patient was discharged by the attending physician," Vell said. "That's not your decision." "I know it's not my decision. That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" Vell's voice was controlled, but she heard the edge under it. "What exactly are you claiming happened?" She looked at him, then at Preem, then at the man she didn't know, who hadn't said a single word. "I'm saying the documentation on Robert Halden doesn't match his clinical presentation. I'm saying the medication he received this morning has no documented clinical basis in his chart. And I'm saying that a patient who came in last night showing signs of early pulmonary compromise was discharged this morning without adequate workup." She kept her voice even. "I'm saying all of that on the record, and I've said it in writing in the system. And if there's an explanation for those discrepancies that I'm not aware of, I would genuinely like to hear it." Nobody offered one. Preem looked at Vell. Vell looked at the window. "Claire," Preem said, "you are an excellent technical nurse. You're precise, you're reliable, and your patient outcomes are good. But there is a pattern, and this has been discussed internally more than once, of you operating outside your scope. Questioning clinical decisions that have been made by licensed physicians. Creating friction in team dynamics." "Creating friction," she said. "Yes." "By flagging documentation errors. By creating a narrative of error where clinical judgment exists." A pause. "We've made a decision. Effective immediately, your employment with Hargrove Memorial is terminated. You'll be escorted from the premises, and we'll process your final pay according to standard procedure." There it was. She'd known, somewhere in the last 40 minutes, that this was where it was going. Knowing it didn't make the room feel any less strange. The particular quality of silence after a thing is said out loud that cannot be unsaid, The way everyone else in the room suddenly seemed to be looking at something just slightly to the side of her face. "I want it on record," she said, "that I'm disputing this termination." "You can file through HR," Preem said. He stood. "Dana will walk you to your locker." She stood. She looked, one more time, at the man she didn't know. I was looking back at her now, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite what she expected. Not satisfaction, not hostility. Something more like assessment, like he was measuring something. She didn't look away first. Then she turned and followed Dana out the door. The walk back through the ER was longer than the building required. It felt deliberate, that route, through the main floor, past the nurses' station, past the patients in curtained bays, past the tech desk where Priya was updating vitals boards and went quiet when she saw them coming. Dana walked slightly behind Claire, which was either courtesy or theater. The staff watched. Some of them looked away quickly. Some of them didn't look away at all. A nurse named Ben, who had worked beside Claire for 3 of her 4 years at Hargrove, met her eyes for a moment. Something moved across his face, something that wanted to be more than it was. And then he looked down at the chart he was holding and said nothing. She'd expected that. She hadn't expected how much it would land anyway. At her locker, she changed her shoes, took off the stethoscope she'd had for 6 years, a lit man, bought in another life for a different kind of work, and put it in her bag. Her badge, she left on the shelf. She had her phone, her wallet, the 2 folded pages of chart documentation she'd pocketed earlier. She had the photograph she'd taken of the discharge summary. She had everything that mattered. The security guard who escorted her to the exit was young and visibly uncomfortable. He held the door without being asked, which she found oddly decent. Outside, Salt Lake City was doing what it did in early November. Cold sun, dry air, the mountains in the distance looking close enough to touch in the way they always did in this light. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at nothing in particular. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then she answered. Silence for a moment. Then a voice, male, measured, speaking carefully. "You're going to receive a message in approximately 40 minutes. Don't delete it before you read it, and don't contact anyone at the hospital until you do." The call ended. She stood there. Somewhere above her, on the 3rd floor of Hargrove Memorial, the man she hadn't been able to identify was still sitting in that conference room, and whatever he knew about Robert Halden and falsified charts and a medication with no documented clinical basis, whatever that added up to, it was already in motion. She knew that feeling. She'd had it before, in a different context entirely, in places that had nothing to do with hospital administration. The feeling of a situation that had already passed the point where it could be quietly resolved. The feeling of something that had been in motion for longer than anyone had told her. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady. She walked to her car, and somewhere across the city, in a location she didn't know yet, a man named Robert Halden was either safe or he wasn't, and everything that happened next was going to depend on which one was true. She sat in her car for 11 minutes without starting the engine. Not because she was falling apart, she wasn't, or at least not in the way that would have been visible to anyone watching from outside. She sat because she needed to think before she moved, and moving felt like the kind of thing that should be intentional right now. The parking structure was dim and smelled like exhaust and concrete, and somewhere 2 levels up, a car alarm was cycling through its sequence with the particular persistence of something nobody was going to do anything about. She thought about Robert Halden. She thought about the way he'd said, "Be careful," not as a pleasantry, not as filler, but in the deliberate tone of someone who had spent time around situations where that phrase carried actual weight. She thought about the agency code on his emergency contact line, the medication that had no documented basis, the way the man in the conference room had watched her without saying a single word. She thought about the voice on the phone. "Don't contact anyone at the hospital until you do." 40 minutes, he'd said. She started the engine and drove. She didn't go home. Home was a 1-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from the hospital that she'd never quite finished making feel like hers. There were still boxes in the second closet from when she'd moved in, which was longer ago than she liked to admit. She drove instead to a diner 3 miles east that she'd been to twice, chosen because it had parking in the back and booths that faced the door. Old habits. She ordered coffee she didn't need and a piece of pie she wasn't going to eat, and sat in the back corner and put her phone on the table and watched it. The message arrived in 37 minutes, not a text, An encrypted application she'd never installed. It had appeared on her phone as a push notification, prompted a one-click install, and opened to a single conversation thread with no profile, no username, just a string of numbers and a timestamp. The message was a document, 12 pages. The header was a string of alphanumeric code she didn't immediately recognize, but the format was federal. She'd seen enough paperwork in her previous life to know what agency-generated documentation looked like, even without the letterhead. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the table, face down, and looked at her coffee for a moment. Hargrove Memorial Hospital had not appeared in any federal documentation by accident. According to what she was looking at, a division of the hospital's research affiliate, a subsidiary so structurally separated from the main institution that most staff wouldn't know it existed, had been under preliminary investigation for 14 months. The investigation concerned a pattern of adverse patient outcomes that had initially appeared as routine complication rates until an analyst at a federal health oversight body had noticed a statistical anomaly. Patients admitted with certain qualifying conditions in a specific demographic range were dying at a rate that was elevated in a way that couldn't be explained by case complexity alone. The investigation had a name, Stillwater, and according to the document, Robert Halden was not a patient who had wandered into Hargrove with high blood pressure. He was an investigator. He had been embedded, that was the word used, embedded, in a consulting role connected to one of Hargrove's research partners for the past 8 months. 4 weeks ago, he had transmitted a preliminary report suggesting the anomaly was not statistical noise, but the result of deliberate manipulation, patients being administered unapproved compound protocols under the cover of standard treatment designations, with outcomes tracked, recorded, and then selectively removed from the accessible chart system. 3 weeks ago, Halden had gone quiet. 2 weeks ago, his supervisor had flagged his status as uncertain. Last night, he had appeared in Hargrove's emergency room with a cardiac presentation that the document described as inconsistent with his known medical history. The document ended with a single line at the bottom of the last page, different from the rest in that it appeared to have been added manually rather than generated by the report's original formatting system. You were the only person in that building who read his chart like it mattered. We need to talk. Claire turned her phone back over and looked at it. Her coffee was cold. Outside the diner window, Salt Lake City was going about its business. A delivery truck double-parked on the corner, 2 women walking fast against the wind with their coat collars up, a kid on a bike taking the curb at a bad angle and correcting at the last second. The ordinary machinery of a Wednesday morning, entirely indifferent to the 12 pages she'd just read. She thought about the man in the conference room, the one who hadn't introduced himself and hadn't said a word and had watched her with the careful, neutral attention of someone conducting an evaluation. She thought about Gerald Preem saying, "We've made a decision," with the particular confidence of a man who believed the decision was final. She ordered more coffee because her hands needed something to do, and she thought about the last time she had been in a situation where a piece of paper changed the shape of everything around it. That had been in a different kind of building, in a different part of her life, and she had been wearing different clothes and carrying different equipment, and the stakes had been of a kind that didn't translate directly into anything that happened in a hospital. But some things translated, the geometry of it translated. The way a situation that looks like one thing, a termination, a disciplinary action, a quiet institutional closing of ranks, is actually something else viewed from a different altitude. The way the people who feel most in control of a situation are often the people who understand it least. She had $40 in her wallet, her phone, the 2 folded pages from Halden's chart, the photographs of his discharge summary, and the login credentials for a documentation system she technically no longer had access to, but whose access termination would require an IT work order that, in her experience, took between 4 and 24 hours to process. She paid for the coffee, left the pie, sat in her car, opened the hospital's documentation portal on her phone, and confirmed her credentials still worked. They did. She had at most a few hours. She started with the research affiliate records, which were accessible through a back-end reporting system she'd discovered by accident 2 years ago while tracking down a misrouted lab result. The affiliate was called Meridian Clinical Partners. It appeared in the hospital system as a billing code, essentially, a category into which certain research-adjacent patient encounters were routed, separate from the main encounter billing. She'd noticed it before and assumed it was administrative. She looked at it now with different eyes. The volume was wrong. Meridian Clinical Partners had billed for approximately 340 patient encounters over the past 18 months. Hargrove's research program, as publicly disclosed, had enrolled fewer than 100 patients in that same period. The delta between those two numbers was not explainable by administrative rounding or billing categorization. She started cross-referencing the Meridian billing codes against patient admission records. This was slower because the systems didn't talk to each other directly, and she was essentially doing manually what a database join would do automatically, which meant she was working from memory and pattern recognition across two different interfaces. She'd done more tedious things. She made a list on a napkin, 3 columns, patient identifiers, dates, billing codes, and worked through it methodically. She was 20 minutes in when her phone rang. Unknown number, different from this morning, different cadence to the ring, which was irrational information, but she noted it anyway. "Yes," she said. "You read the file." A man's voice. Direct, no preamble. "I read it. We need to meet. You called me twice today without identifying yourself. Give me something first." A pause. Not a long one. "My name is Theodore Vance. I work for a federal health enforcement division that I can't fully disclose over a cell call. I'm the one who sent you the file. How did you get on my phone?" "Your number was in Halden's contact list. He flagged you 3 days ago." "He flagged me," she said. "He'd never met me." "He'd met your incident reports. You filed 2 in the past 6 months about documentation irregularities at Hargrove. Both were routed through the state health board's reporting system. Both were reviewed by our office." A brief pause. "You saw things other people in that building were paid not to see." She looked out through the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of her car. "Where do you want to meet?" she said. They met in a federal building on the west side of the city that had no visible signage beyond the standard GSA address placard. Vance was waiting in a ground-floor conference room, mid-50s, economical in his movements, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent watchfulness. He had 2 other people with him, a younger woman with a laptop who didn't introduce herself, and a man in his late 40s who introduced himself as Ray and shook Claire's hand with a firmness that felt like a statement. The documents on the table were physical, which meant this room wasn't connected to anything that could be accessed remotely. "Halden is safe," Vance said, before she could ask. "He's with us. He's not in great shape, but he's stable." "What did they give him?" "We're still working on that. His tox screen came back with something we're having analyzed, a compound that doesn't have a clean match in standard pharmacological databases." "That's the protocol," Claire said. "That's what Meridian is running. Unapproved compound protocols under standard treatment designations. I found the billing pattern this morning." Vance looked at Ray. Ray picked up a folder, looked at something inside it, set it back down. "The billing pattern is one piece," he said. "We've known about Meridian for 7 months. The problem is that the documentation system inside Hargrove is compartmentalized in a way that's made it difficult to establish chain of evidence between the research affiliate and specific patient outcomes. The records that should connect those dots have either been modified or are stored in a closed access partition we haven't been able to get into legally. Because you'd need internal access. We'd need someone with clinical access who could identify the right records from within the system," Vance said. "Which is a problem, because the people inside that system who might have noticed were either reassigned, voluntarily transferred, or," he paused, "in one case, left the profession." She understood what he was not saying. "The nurses who flagged concerns before I did," she said. 2 nurses and 1 resident, the younger woman said, without looking up from her laptop. "Over a period of about 2 years, none of them were explicitly retaliated against in a way we could document. They just stopped working there." Claire thought about Ben at the nurses' station that morning, looking down at his chart. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your access is still live," Vance said, "for maybe a few more hours." "Then we need to move today." He leaned forward. "We need you to navigate the documentation system and locate the closed partition records. Not download them. We can't use data obtained outside a legal access framework. We need you to identify where they are and what record identifiers they carry so we can obtain a targeted warrant for specific files rather than a broad system pull, which Hargrove's legal team would fight for 6 months. You want me to do it now?" "We want you to do it now." She looked at him. "I was terminated 4 hours ago." Your access hasn't been revoked. That doesn't make it authorized. Vance met her eyes. You filed an incident report this morning before they terminated you. That report is formally in the system. As a reporting party in an active patient safety complaint, you have a case for reviewing records connected to your report. It's a thin case, and any defense attorney would argue it, but it gives us enough to move. It gives you enough to move, she said. What does it give me? Silence for a moment. Nothing, Vance said. I'm not going to tell you it gives you anything. You've already been fired. The records, if we find them, establish that the termination was retaliatory, which gives you grounds to pursue reinstatement. But that's a civil process, and it takes time, and I can't promise outcomes. He didn't look away. What I can tell you is that there are patients who are enrolled in Meridian's protocols without their knowledge. Some of them are probably fine, some of them aren't, and the people inside that building who could tell us which is which are not going to talk. She sat with that. It was a different kind of weight than she'd expected. Not heavier, she'd carried heavier, in different forms, in the years before she'd decided to become the kind of person who worked in hospitals. Just differently shaped. The weight of something that wasn't going to resolve neatly, that was going to have costs she couldn't fully calculate yet, that required her to make a decision based on incomplete information in a compressed timeline. She'd done that before, too. Give me a workstation, she said. The younger woman slid a laptop across the table. Claire spent 40 minutes inside Hargrove's documentation system, working methodically through the administrative partition that connected the main EMR to the Meridian Clinical Partners billing hub. She'd been right about the timeline for credential revocation. Her access was still fully live, which meant IT hadn't received the termination order yet, or had received it and hadn't processed it, either of which gave her a window. The closed access partition wasn't hidden in the way she'd expected. It was hidden in the way that things were usually hidden by people who weren't primarily hiding something from investigators. They were hiding it from internal auditors, from curious nurses, from the kind of low-level scrutiny that happens when documents are filed in the wrong place, which meant it was tucked into a subdirectory of the research billing module that was labeled with a code designation she would have had no reason to click on if she hadn't known what she was looking for. She found it in 22 minutes. The partition contained 412 patient records. She didn't open them. Vance had been clear about that, and she understood why. She documented the directory path, the record identifier format, the date range of the files, and the administrative access credentials that appeared in the partition's header metadata. Then she closed the directory and exited the system. 412, she said. The room was quiet. We disclosed 100 patient enrollment, Ray said. I know. Vance was already on his phone. She watched him step out of the room, watched Ray and the younger woman exchange a look that was professional but not quite controlled, and she sat back in the chair and noticed for the first time that she was tired in the specific way she got when she'd been running on something other than actual energy for too long. The afternoon moved the way afternoons did in situations that had a lot of waiting built into them. Vance came back. Documents were discussed. A federal warrant application was being prepared. Ray explained, in more detail than was strictly necessary, the legal framework under which the warrant would be sought and the timeline for judicial review, which Claire translated in her head to mean, we have what we need, but there are several more hours of bureaucratic process before anything happens, and you should probably eat something. She ate a granola bar from her bag and thought about Robert Halden and whatever facility they'd taken him to, and about the compound in his system that didn't match anything in standard pharmacological databases, and about the 312 patients whose files existed in a partition that nobody at Hargrove was supposed to know about. At 4:15, her phone rang. Ben. From the nurse's station. Ben, who had looked at his chart that morning rather than meet her eyes. She almost let it go. She answered. Hey, he said. He sounded like someone who had rehearsed something and then lost the script. I wanted to... I don't know, I'm sorry about this morning. I should have said something. You're calling me from the hospital? I'm in my car. I clocked out early. A pause. Something's happening here. They've been going through the unit documentation since about 1 o'clock. Dana has been in meetings since noon and nobody on the floor knows what's happening. And about an hour ago, 2 guys I didn't recognize went into the records room with a hospital administrator and they've been in there ever since. She was already sitting up straighter. What did these guys look like? She said. I don't know, professional. Suits. Not legal, not HR. One of them had a badge of some kind, but I didn't see the issuing body. She looked at Vance across the conference room table. He was watching her with the focused stillness of someone who had noticed her posture change. Ben, she said carefully, I need you to do something, not for me, for the patients who were on the Meridian billing track. Can you go back in and look up how many active patients on your floor have Meridian billing codes attached to their encounters? A silence. I'm not supposed to know what that is, he said. I know. How do you know what that is? I'll explain later. Right now I need that number. A longer silence. She heard him breathing, heard ambient car noise, heard him making a decision in real time. Give me 10 minutes, he said. He called back in 8. 14, he said. 14 patients currently admitted with Meridian codes. 6 of them are on protocols I didn't recognize. I had to look up the drug designations. 2 of them I can't find any record of a primary physician ordering the protocol. It's listed like it was always there. Are they okay, the patients? I don't know. They look stable. But Claire, he stopped. One of them is a woman who came in 3 days ago. She came in for routine cardiac monitoring. She shouldn't be on a research protocol at all. She didn't sign any consent forms that I can see. The room felt very still. Ben, don't say anything to anyone on the floor. Don't touch those charts. Go home. I can't just... 14 patients, Ben. If you start asking questions internally, whoever is cleaning up those records right now will know someone on the floor noticed. Go home. A pause. Okay, he said. Okay. She ended the call. She looked at Vance. You need to add a patient safety hold to whatever you're filing. There are 14 active patients at Hargrove on Meridian protocols right now, and at least some of them didn't consent. Vance was already on his feet. The afternoon compressed after that. Phone calls she wasn't privy to, people coming in and out of the conference room, Ray typing with intense focus on a document that grew visibly longer each time she glanced at it. She was not the center of this room and had no expectation of being. She understood her role. She had provided the access point, the directory path, the record identifiers. What happened next was in other hands. She was fine with that. What she was not fine with, she discovered around 6 in the evening, was the call she received from a number she did recognize, Gerald Preem. She stared at his name on her screen for one full ring. Then she answered, Ms. Whitmore. His voice had the particular quality of controlled displeasure, a man who had managed a lot of difficult conversations and had learned to keep them smooth even when they weren't. I understand you've had contact with individuals representing themselves as federal officials today. I've had contact with federal officials today, she said. I want to be very clear about something, he said. What you did this morning, accessing the hospital system after your termination, constitutes unauthorized access to protected health information. That's a HIPAA violation. We will be exploring our legal options. She looked at the table in front of her. Vance had come to stand in the doorway when her phone rang, and he was watching the conversation without appearing to watch it. Mr. Preem, she said, I filed an incident report this morning before my termination. In my capacity as a reporting party in a patient safety complaint, I accessed records relevant to that complaint. I'd encourage your legal team to look carefully at the distinction between unauthorized access and whistleblower-protected activity before they start drafting anything. A silence that told her he hadn't expected her to say that. Furthermore, she continued, I'd recommend looking into the current status of your records room. I understand there's been some activity in there this afternoon. The silence that followed was different. When Preem spoke again, his voice had lost some of its smoothness. Who have you been talking to? I've been having a very productive day, she said. Thanks for calling. She ended the call. Her heart was going a little faster than she wanted it to. That happened. She'd learned a long time ago that steady hands and a steady voice didn't mean the rest of her system was unmoved. It just meant she knew the difference between what she felt and what she showed. Vance crossed the room and sat down across from her. Preem, he said. Preem. What did he want? To threaten me with a HIPAA violation and find out how much I know. She set her phone down. He knows something is happening. Someone inside told him. We expected that. How long until the warrant comes through? Vance's expression didn't change, which was itself informative. That depends on judicial scheduling. Tonight, best case. Tomorrow morning, Realistic case. And between now and then, those 412 records are inside a system being managed by people who now know an investigation is active. He looked at her steadily. They can't delete what they don't know we've identified. They know someone was in the system today. I used my own credentials, which were valid credentials connected to an active incident report. That's not going to stop them from wondering what I found. She sat forward. Vance, how long has this investigation been running? 14 months. And in 14 months, you have statistical anomalies and a preliminary report from an embedded investigator who they nearly killed. You have billing irregularities and a partition of records that you can now point a warrant at, but haven't opened yet. She looked at him. What happens if those records are modified before the warrant clears? A pause. Then we build the case from what we have, which is circumstantial, which is a starting point. She leaned back. There's someone else, she said. In Halden's original report, he transmitted a preliminary document 3 weeks before he went quiet. In the file you sent me, there was a reference to a secondary source, someone inside Hargrove who corroborated his findings. That person isn't identified. Vance said nothing. You know who it is? She said. Still nothing. Vance. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up. There was a physician on staff at Hargrove for 6 years. He came to us 11 months ago with internal documentation that he'd retained before it was removed from the system. He's been cooperating quietly. A pause. 3 days ago, he stopped responding to contact. The room felt different. His name? She said. We're not disclosing it at this stage. Why 3 days ago? That's what we're trying to determine. She sat with that for a moment. 3 days ago. The same timeline as when Halden had flagged her in his contact file. The same period in which someone inside Hargrove had apparently decided the situation needed to be accelerated. Halden's mysterious cardiac presentation, his carefully altered chart, his rapid discharge. Someone inside that building had known an investigation was closing in, and they hadn't gone quiet. They'd started cleaning up. Her phone lit up on the table. Not a call. A text from a number she'd never seen, no contact name. A single line of text and an image attachment. She opened the image. It was a photograph. Low light, slightly blurred. A hospital corridor she recognized. 3rd floor of Hargrove, the research wing, which was restricted access and which she had walked through exactly once during a facility tour in her first month of employment. Standing in the corridor in profile were 2 men. One of them was the unidentified man from the conference room that morning. The other was Dr. Marcus Vell, and between them, visible in the edge of the frame, was a gurney being moved toward the elevator. On the gurney was a person. She looked at the image for a long moment. The person on the gurney was too far from the camera to identify with certainty. But the oxygen equipment visible on the gurney rail was distinctive, a specific configuration she recognized from critical transport protocols, not an internal transfer. A patient being moved out. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then the phone buzzed again. Same number. No text this time, just a 6-digit room number and the words, "They're moving him tonight." She showed Vance the phone. He looked at the image for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the text. Then he said, "Who sent this?" In a tone that had gone from managed to sharp in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "I don't know." Same number as the earlier calls? No, new number. He took the phone from her hand, not roughly, but with the decisiveness of someone who had stopped asking permission, and crossed the room to where the younger woman was sitting. "Trace this number, now. I want carrier, location ping, everything." Then he turned back to Claire. "The room number in the text, do you recognize it?" She looked at it again. 3rd floor, research wing. "That's the restricted access section. I've been there once. There are patient rooms up there, but they're not on the main admission roster. They're listed under the Meridian billing track." "A private patient floor," Ray said. "Not exactly private. More like invisible. If you're not looking at Meridian codes, those rooms don't show up in the standard census." Vance was already on his phone, moving toward the corridor. She could hear fragments. Active patient transport, 3rd floor, need eyes on the building. And then his voice dropped below audible, and he was through the door and she was sitting at the table with Ray and the younger woman, who was typing with an urgency that made the room feel smaller. "The person on the gurney," Ray said. Can you describe the oxygen equipment configuration again? She described it. He wrote something down. That's a portable ventilator setup, not standard interward transport. No, she said. That's a configuration you'd use if someone was being moved to a facility without adequate respiratory support on site. You'd want to sustain on the way rather than assume continuity on arrival. Or, Ray said, and he didn't finish the sentence. She finished it in her head. Or if you weren't planning on the patient arriving at a facility at all. Vance came back in 4 minutes that felt considerably longer. I've got 2 agents on their way to Hargrove. We're not in a position to enter that building officially until the warrant clears. Going in without it, especially after Preem's call, gives their lawyers grounds to move for suppression on everything. So they walk a patient out the service entrance, and there's nothing you can do, she said. Not nothing. My agents can surveil. If they observe a patient transport, they can intervene on patient welfare grounds. We don't need a warrant to respond to an observable medical situation. That depends on your agents getting there before the transport leaves the building. Vance checked his watch. How long for the warrant? She said. I've got a federal judge on the phone. We're looking at minimum 45 minutes for review and signature. Where's Halden right now? Secure location. He's stable. The physician who stopped responding 3 days ago, is he inside that building? The pause before Vance answered was approximately 1 second too long. We don't know, he said. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. I do, she said. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed. Not surprise exactly, more like the controlled recalibration of a room full of people who had been managing this situation and had just registered a variable they hadn't adequately weighted. Claire, Vance said, I still have valid credentials. I have a patient safety complaint active in the system. I have documented clinical concerns about patients on the 3rd floor of that building. She was putting her jacket on. Vance, you need eyes in that building right now, and you can't put your agents in there for 45 minutes. I can. You're not law enforcement. I'm a registered nurse with an active incident report and clinical access, going to check on patients about whom I have documented concerns. She looked at him steadily. That is not illegal. It is if you're doing it for reasons other than patient care. I'm going for patient care. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing multiple calculations simultaneously, legal exposure, operational necessity, the gap between what was right and what was sanctioned. You are not to engage with hospital security, he said. You are not to confront Vel or Preem or anyone else in that building. You go in, you locate the transport situation, you call me. And if the patient is being moved while I'm in there, you document, you call, you do not intervene physically. She didn't say anything to that. Claire, I heard you, she said. She left before he could decide to stop her. The drive to Hargrove took 9 minutes at that hour, and she spent the time thinking about logistics rather than outcomes because outcomes were too variable and logistics were something she could control. Staff entrance on the south side of the building was accessible via keycard. Her keycard, which had presumably been deactivated along with her system credentials, but which worked on a separate access control system with a different IT department and a different revocation process. She'd been terminated at 9:15 in the morning. It was 6:47 in the evening. She was betting on bureaucratic lag. She parked 2 blocks away, walked to the south entrance, held her card to the reader. The light went green. Inside, Hargrove at evening shift change was organized chaos in the way that hospitals always were at that hour. The particular density of staff in motion that meant nobody was scrutinizing individual faces because everyone was focused on handover. She walked like she knew where she was going, which was a technique that worked in hospitals the same way it worked everywhere else. The stairs to the 3rd floor were at the east end of the building, behind a door marked Authorized Personnel. Her keycard worked there too. The research wing was quieter than she'd expected. The corridor was lit at reduced level. Overhead fluorescence on a dimmer setting, which wasn't unusual for a ward at this hour, but the combined effect of the lower light and the reduced foot traffic made the space feel different from the rest of the building, like a different institution occupying the same walls. She counted rooms from the stairwell door. The number from the text message was the 6th door on the left. She passed the 1st, the 2nd. Through the small window of the 3rd room, she could see a patient in bed, monitoring leads attached, the screen of a bedside monitor showing a rhythm she couldn't read at this angle. Through the 4th, another patient, also monitored. The 5th door was closed without a window. The sixth door was open. The room was empty. Not recently vacated, the bed was made with the particular tightness of a bed that had been stripped and remade, not the managed disorder of a room between patients. The equipment was docked and powered down. There was nothing personal, no residual clinical setup, nothing on the whiteboard beside the door, except a room number. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she heard it. Down the corridor from the direction of what she remembered as the service elevator. A mechanical sound, the kind that elevators made not when they were running, but when they had recently stopped. And voices. Talking low. She moved. Not running. Walking with purpose in the direction of a nurse who knew where she was going and why, which was the only mode available to her right now. The corridor curved slightly at the far end, and as she came around it, she saw them. Two men she didn't recognize in orderly uniforms pushing a gurney. The patient on the gurney was male, intubated, with a portable ventilator attached to the rail. The same configuration she had described to Ray 40 minutes ago. He was connected to a transport monitor showing vital signs she could read clearly from 8 feet away. Heart rate in the 80s, oxygen saturation 91 on the vent, blood pressure low but not critical. Standing beside the gurney, speaking quietly to the orderlies, was Dr. Marcus Vell. He looked up when she rounded the corner. The 2 seconds that followed had a specific quality, a moment of mutual recognition in which both parties understood what the other's presence meant and both were calculating. Claire. His voice was controlled, but she heard the seam in it. You don't have access to this floor. My credentials cleared the stairwell door 30 seconds ago, she said. Dr. Vell, who is this patient and where are you taking him? This is a private research transfer. It doesn't concern you. I can see his vitals from here. His SAT is 91 on ventilatory support. That's not stable for transport. I'm managing his care. You're moving him at 7 in the evening from a ward that doesn't appear in the main patient census. She kept her voice clinical, level, the same voice she'd used 1,000 times in emergency situations, because clinical and level was what the situation needed from her. What's his documented consent status for this transfer? Who authorized the transport? I authorized the transport. What's his name? A pause that lasted slightly too long. That's protected information. She looked at the patient. He was sedated, clearly. The muscle relaxation and the absence of respiratory effort against the vent told her he was pharmacologically paralyzed, which was appropriate for intubated transport, but which also meant he couldn't communicate, couldn't respond, couldn't do anything to indicate whether he was here voluntarily or otherwise. She looked at his left forearm, which was visible below the blanket edge. There was a bruise there. Not an IV infiltration bruise. The shape was wrong. The color distribution was wrong. It was the kind of bruise that came from a pressure hold. Dr. Vell, she said, I need to see this patient's wristband. You need to leave this floor. I need to see this patient's wristband. She heard, distantly, the sound of the stairwell door she'd come through opening. Vell heard it too. What happened next was not smooth, and it was not clean, and it did not resemble anything from a procedural drama. Vell said something to the orderlies in a tone she couldn't parse as a word, but understood as a command, and the taller of the two men stepped forward and put himself between her and the gurney with the practiced lateral movement of someone who had done it before. Not a hospital orderly. The body mechanics were wrong. She stepped back. Not retreating, creating space, which was different. I've got a documentation concern regarding this patient, she said, loudly enough to carry. I'm calling it in to the charge nurse. She had her phone out already. Vell said, You're not employed here. I'm a nurse observing what appears to be an unauthorized patient transport. That's a mandated reporting situation regardless of employment status. The footsteps from the stairwell were closer now. And then they were there. 2 people came around the corner from the direction of the stairwell. Not Vance's agents, not anyone she expected. The first was a woman in her late 50s, gray hair, wearing a civilian jacket over what looked like hospital administration attire. The second was a man she'd never seen before, wearing a federal marshal's badge on a lanyard, who took in the scene in approximately 1 second and moved his hand to his hip in a gesture that was not a draw, but was a very clear statement of intent. Dr. Marcus Vell, the marshal said, I need you to step away from the gurney. Vell's face did something complicated. This is a lawful medical transport, he said. I don't know who you are or what authority. Federal warrant is being transmitted to this building's administrative systems right now, the marshal said. That patient is not to be moved pending review of his case documentation. Step away from the gurney. The tall man in the orderly uniform made a decision. It was the wrong one. He moved toward the marshal in a way that was unambiguous, and Claire was already moving. Not toward the marshal, not toward Vel, but toward the gurney, because the monitor was showing a rhythm change she didn't like. The kind of shift that happened when a sedated patient's physiology registered stress, even when their consciousness couldn't. She got to the gurney before anyone else did, checked the vent settings by muscle memory, tidal volume, respiratory rate, FiO2, and reached for the monitor to run a quick strip. Behind her, the situation resolved itself in a way she didn't watch but heard. A collision, a voice saying get on the ground with the particular authority of someone who was not going to say it twice, and then the specific sound of compliance, not graceful, not quiet, but definitive. Is he stable? The woman in the civilian jacket asked from behind her. He's maintaining, Claire said. His SAT is dropping slightly. I need someone to tell me what's in this vent circuit. If they modified the settings before transport, I need to know the baseline. We'll get you his file. I need it now, not in 5 minutes. Now. She looked at the monitor. He's been on this vent for at least 4 hours based on the interface indicators. If they've been adjusting his sedation without documentation, I don't know what his actual medication load is. The woman spoke into a radio. Vel was against the wall, not in restraints, not yet, with the marshal positioned between him and the gurney. His face had undergone a transformation Claire found less satisfying than she'd imagined. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more like a man realizing that the structure he had been standing on was not what he had believed it to be. The patient's file, Claire said again. Working on it, the woman said, work faster. She held the patient's wrist, not for a pulse, she had the monitor for that, but because that was what you did. You held the wrist. You let the patient's body know that someone was there who was paying attention to them rather than to everything else happening in the room. She didn't know if it mattered to a pharmacologically paralyzed man. She did it anyway. The file came through on the woman's tablet 2 minutes later, and she handed it across. The patient's name was Dr. Elliot Marsh. Not related to Dana. She checked that first, automatically, because the surname hit her before the first name did. No relation. Elliot Marsh, physician, 43 years old, admitted to the Meridian ward 3 days ago under a designation that read as voluntary clinical observation, but which, based on the admission documentation, had been initiated by hospital administration rather than by the patient or any external party. He was the cooperating physician, the one who had stopped responding. He hadn't stopped responding because he'd changed his mind. He had stopped responding because they had him. She looked at his vent settings, at his medication log, at the sedation protocol listed in the file. And the sedation protocol listed in the file did not match the vent settings on the machine, which told her that somewhere between his documented care plan and his actual treatment, someone had made adjustments that were not recorded. The implications of that moved through her clinical reasoning in about 4 seconds and landed somewhere she didn't have time to fully process, because right now she needed to act on it. His vent rate is too high for the documented sedation dose, she said. If his actual sedation is heavier than documented, he's being overventilated for his current CO2 load. I need a capnography reading. We don't have... Is there a crash cart on this floor? Room 3. Get it. The next 20 minutes were the kind of 20 minutes that didn't feel like 20 minutes while they were happening. She worked with the resources available, which were imperfect. The portable capnography on the crash cart gave her end-tidal CO2 readings that confirmed her suspicion and let her adjust the vent rate to something more appropriate for what she was actually dealing with. Marsh's saturation climbed from 91 to 96. His cardiac rhythm stabilized into something she was willing to call acceptable given everything else. She stood back and realized her hands were trembling slightly. Not badly, but there. She'd noticed over the years that her hands waited until the acute phase was over before they did that. It was considerate of them, in a way. Vance arrived at 7:22 with 2 agents and a man she'd never seen who presented credentials that resulted in the marshal nodding and stepping aside. The warrant was apparently live. Hargrove Memorial Hospital was now an active federal crime scene, and the 3rd-floor research ward was being locked down. She told Vance about Marsh in the corridor outside room 3, keeping it clinical and sequential because that was the most efficient way to convey what mattered. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Is he going to be okay? Vance asked. He's stable. He needs to be transferred to an ICU that's not this building, and I want someone from outside this hospital managing his care because I have no way of knowing what else they gave him that isn't in his file. A pause. And I want a real toxicology panel, not a standard screen, the same kind you ran on Halden. I'll make that call. Where's Vel? Being detained. He looked at her. You did good tonight. She didn't say anything to that. She meant to go home. She walked to her car, sat in it, and called Vance from the parking lot to confirm Marsh's transfer status. He was being moved to a different facility, transport arranged, someone from outside the Hargrove system managing it. She confirmed. She sat. Her phone had 17 messages from numbers she didn't recognize. She didn't look at them. She looked at the building. Hargrove Memorial lit up in the evening like every hospital she'd ever worked in. The organized glow of a place that was supposed to be about keeping people alive. The ordinary business of medicine continuing on the floors where none of this had happened, patients being assessed and monitored and cared for by nurses who were doing their jobs without knowing what had been happening 30 feet above them. She thought about the 412 records in the partition, 312 patients above the disclosed enrollment number. She'd been so focused on Halden and then Marsh that she hadn't let herself fully sit with what that number meant. 412 people who had come into this hospital for something specific, a cardiac event, a respiratory issue, a routine admission, and had been enrolled in a protocol without their knowledge, given compounds that weren't documented, whose outcomes had been tracked and then selectively erased. Some of them were probably fine. Some of them had died. And for 14 months, that number had been sitting in a partition on a server in this building while the people responsible continued showing up to work every morning. She started the engine. Her phone rang before she could pull out of the space. Unknown number, but a different format, longer, which usually meant international. She answered on reflex. Silence for a moment. Then a voice she didn't know. Male, older, speaking with the deliberate clarity of someone who was choosing every word. Ms. Whitmore, my name is Congressman Daniel Farrow. I chair the House Committee on Healthcare Oversight. A pause. I've been briefed on the situation at Hargrove Memorial. I want you to know that what you've done tonight has opened a case that we've been trying to build for over a year. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'm calling, Farrow continued, because I want you to understand the scope of what you've walked into. Meridian Clinical Partners is not an isolated operation. Hargrove was one of 7 hospitals. She put the car back in park. 7, she said. We believe approximately 3,000 patients across 4 states have been enrolled in unapproved protocols through the Meridian network. The company operating behind the affiliate structure has federal contracts worth over $400 million. The executives involved have relationships with people at several levels of regulatory oversight. A pause. Which is why, despite 14 months of investigation, we haven't been able to get traction until tonight. 3,000 patients. She looked at the building. What does tonight change? She said. Tonight we have a physician who was illegally detained inside a federally regulated facility. We have a patient transport being executed without documented consent. We have an active federal warrant, and we have evidence of deliberate alteration of clinical records that can now be tied to specific patient outcomes. Another pause. And we have you, a nurse who documented the discrepancies, filed a formal report before she was terminated, and then located the partition index that gives us the specific record identifiers we need for the full warrant package. She was quiet. Ms. Whitmore, I want to ask you something directly. When we go public with this, and we will go public, we're going to need someone who can speak to what happened inside that hospital in clinical terms that a non-medical audience can understand. Someone who can explain what these protocols meant for real patients in plain language. I'm not a public spokesperson, she said. I'm not asking you to be one. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to brief our committee when the time comes. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. When the time comes, she said. Yes. Good. A pause. One more thing. Vance tells me you acted tonight on information from an anonymous source who sent you a photograph and a room number. We haven't been able to identify that number. Neither have I. Are you expecting further contact? She thought about it. The 2 calls, the image, the 6-digit room number. The word tonight, with its particular urgency. Someone who had known where Marsh was, had known the transport was being planned, had known who Claire was and what she'd done, and had chosen her specifically. "I don't know," she said. "If you hear from them again—" "I'll call Vance," she said. "Immediately." She ended the call. The parking lot was quiet. One nurse was walking to her car 2 rows over, end of shift, moving slowly in the way of someone who'd been on her feet for 12 hours. She didn't look up, didn't know what had happened above her head tonight. Claire sat. She was thinking about 7 hospitals, about the way Pharaoh had said $400 million with the particular flatness of someone who had been looking at that number long enough that it had stopped being astonishing. About the people at several levels of regulatory oversight who had relationships with the company running this. She was thinking about the man from the conference room that morning, the one who had watched her without saying a word, who she now understood had almost certainly been there to assess how much she knew, and who had apparently been satisfied enough by her termination to believe the situation was contained. She was thinking about what Vel's expression had been when the marshal walked around the corner, and she was thinking about Dana Marsh, Dana, not Elliot, the charge nurse who had told her to document her concerns and wait for rounds. Dana, who had been in meetings since noon. Dana, who had appeared at Claire's elbow in the documentation room with her particular expression and her careful, management-facing neutrality. She pulled out her phone and called Vance. "Dana Marsh," she said when he answered. "The charge nurse on the ER. I need to know what her connection to the Meridian operation is." A pause. "Why?" "Because she knew I was in the documentation system this morning, before anyone should have. Because she deflected every concern I raised about Halden in a way that was too specific to be routine, and because when I was escorted to administration this morning, she positioned herself near the conference room door." She paused. "She's not a bystander in this." A longer pause. "Hold that," Vance said. She heard him talking to someone in the background, short, clipped exchanges, the sound of someone pulling up information. When he came back, his voice had changed. "Dana Marsh," he said. "She appears in the Meridian billing records. Not as a patient. The cold that moved through her was specific." "As what?" "As a payment recipient," Vance said. 14 months of quarterly payments from a Meridian Clinical Partners consulting subsidiary. Categorized as," a pause as he read, "clinical advisory services." She looked at the building again, at the lit windows, at the ordinary hospital going about its business. "Vance," she said, "how many people inside this building are on that list?" He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. And then her phone buzzed in her hand. The same number as before, the one that had sent her the photograph, the room number, the word tonight with its particular weight. This time it was a voice message. She put it on speaker. The voice was female, older, slightly distorted in the way of a call made through a signal scrambler. And what it said, in 11 words, changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about what was happening at Hargrove Memorial. "The man who ordered your termination this morning is not Gerald Preem." She played the message again. 11 words, female voice, signal scrambler, the particular flatness of someone stating a fact rather than making an accusation, which was its own kind of information. Whoever this was, she was not frightened. She was informing. "The man who ordered your termination this morning is not Gerald Preem." Vance was still on the line. "Did you hear that?" she said. "I heard it." A pause. "Forward it to me." She did. Then she sat in this parking lot with the engine running and the heat doing very little against the November cold that had worked its way into the car while she'd been sitting still, and she thought about the conference room that morning. Gerald Preem with his flat hands on the table, Dana Marsh near the door, Vel at the window. And the man she hadn't been able to identify, who hadn't said a word, who had watched her with the careful attention of someone conducting an evaluation. She'd assumed he was there because Preem had brought him. That was the natural read, but the COO brings his people. The assembled administration presents a unified position. The nurse gets walked out. She'd assumed wrong. "The man in the conference room this morning," she said. "The one I couldn't identify. I need to know who he is." Description. She gave it. 50s, deliberate in his presentation, the physical stillness of someone trained to it. She added the one detail she'd kept turning over since this morning, the way he'd assessed her when she looked back at him before leaving. Not hostile, measuring, That's not much to work with, Vance said. It's what I have. Pull the hospital's visitor log for this morning. Anyone who signed into the administrative wing between 8 and 10. Hargrove's visitor system is part of the warrant scope. We'll have it by morning. I'd rather have it now. I know. A pause. Claire, go home. We have agents in the building, we have Marsh in transport, and the warrant is live. What happens next is a process, and the process is not something you can accelerate by sitting in that parking lot. She knew he was right. She drove home anyway instead of going back inside, which was a decision she arrived at not because she'd fully convinced herself, but because she understood that walking back into Hargrove right now, with federal agents already on the premises, would create a complication she didn't need. Her value to this investigation was specific. She'd provided the access point, the records index, the eyewitness account of Marsh's transport. What she could not do was turn herself into an unmanageable variable. She'd been that once, in a different context. She knew what it cost. Her apartment was cold. She'd left a window cracked that morning before a day she'd expected to be ordinary, and the November air had done what November air did. She closed it, turned the heat up, stood in her kitchen, and looked at the refrigerator for a moment before concluding that eating required a decision-making capacity she was currently using for other things. She made tea instead, sat at her small kitchen table with her phone and the 2 folded pages from Halden's chart, which she smoothed out and read again in the better light of her kitchen. The documentation irregularities were subtle. She'd been right about that this morning, and she was still right about it now. Whoever had altered those records knew clinical documentation well enough to make the changes invisible to a quick review. The timestamp sequencing issue, the saturation decimal, the medication timing. None of it was the work of someone who'd done it carelessly. This was practiced, which meant it wasn't the first time, which meant somewhere in those 412 records were the same patterns, multiplied. She wrote down 3 questions on the back of one of the chart pages, because writing things helped her think, and because her phone felt like a device that could be observed in ways her handwriting couldn't. Who is the man from the conference room? Who is the woman with the scrambled voice? What is the connection between those 2 things? She looked at what she'd written. Then she added a 4th line. Why did they fire me publicly instead of quietly? That one had been bothering her since this morning in a way she hadn't been able to articulate until now. If the goal was to contain her, to remove someone who had noticed the documentation irregularities and was asking inconvenient questions, the smart move would have been a quiet administrative reassignment, a schedule change, something that got her off the Halden case without creating a confrontation. Instead, they'd walked her through the emergency room in front of the entire shift. That was a performance, designed to be seen. The question was who needed to see it. She fell asleep at the kitchen table sometime around 11, which she didn't plan and didn't fully realize until she woke up at 4:17 in the morning with her cheek on her forearm and her tea cold and her phone showing 6 missed calls. 3 from Vance, 1 from Ben, 2 from numbers she didn't recognize. She called Vance back. He answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. "We have an identification on your conference room visitor," he said, without preamble. "How?" "Visitor log plus facial recognition through the federal contractor database. His name is Lawrence Griff. He's the Executive Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Nexagen Biosciences." She was awake now. Nexagen. Biosciences was not a name she'd heard before. She said so. "You wouldn't have," Vance said. "They don't have a consumer-facing presence. They operate as a federal contractor in the clinical research space. They design trial protocols, manage data collection, handle regulatory submissions for pharmaceutical clients. Revenue of approximately $2.3 billion annually. They've held federal contracts with the Department of Health for 11 years. She let that sit for a moment. "Nexagen is the company behind Meridian," she said. "Meridian Clinical Partners is a wholly owned subsidiary of a shell company that traces back to a Nexagen investment vehicle through 3 holding structures," Vance said. "Yes. And Lawrence Griff was in that conference room this morning to observe your termination, which tells us that Nexagen was monitoring the Hargrove situation closely enough to send a senior executive to confirm in person that the threat was contained. I'm the threat. A nurse who filed 2 incident reports and was asking questions about documentation irregularities. Yes, that was enough to get their VP of Regulatory Affairs on a plane." She thought about Preem with his flat hands on the table. We've made a decision. The confidence of a man who believed he was executing someone else's plan correctly. Preem knew Griff was there, she said. Almost certainly. But Griff gave the order. That's the working theory. She stood up from the table and moved to the window. Salt Lake City at 4 in the morning was very dark, the mountains invisible, the street below her empty except for a single car moving through the light at the corner. What's Griff's status? He's not in the building. He was logged out of the hospital visitor system at 11:42 this morning, about 2 hours after your termination. He's presumably back in wherever Nexigen operates from, which is primarily Washington, D.C., with offices in 3 other states. Can you hold him? Not yet. We're building toward it. A pause. The warrant execution this evening gave us physical access to the Meridian partition. We're processing those records now. 412 patient files, as you identified. It's going to take time to fully document what's in them, but the preliminary look confirms the pattern. Unapproved compound protocols listed under standard treatment designations, with outcomes that were selectively altered in the accessible chart system, while the actual outcomes were tracked separately in the partition. How many deaths? A pause long enough to tell her he didn't want to answer. Preliminary count is 31, he said. Across Hargrove's enrollment, we haven't started on the other 6 hospitals. She stood at the window and said nothing for a moment. 31 people, who had come into a hospital expecting care and had received instead a controlled experiment run without their knowledge by a company whose name wasn't on any signage, whose presence in the building was routed through billing codes no one was supposed to look at. What do you need from me? She said. Your formal statement, documented under penalty of perjury, covering everything you observed from the moment you arrived at Hargrove yesterday morning until the moment you left the building last night. We need it as a clean narrative that can be used in the federal filing. When? This morning. Can you come in at 8? Yes. She spent the hours between 4:17 and 7:30 doing the things she could control. She showered, changed, ate something actual, scrambled eggs, which she cooked badly because she was thinking about other things, but which had the advantage of being food. She wrote out a long-form timeline on paper, sequencing everything from the moment she'd picked up Halden's chart at 6:50 yesterday morning through the voice message in the parking lot. Dates, times, clinical observations, exact wording of key conversations, sequence of documentation access. She was a nurse. Notes were how she thought. At 6:40, Ben called again. She answered this time. Dana didn't come in this morning, he said. His voice had the specific quality of someone processing something they hadn't fully categorized yet. She called out sick at 5 a.m., first time in 3 years. I know why, Claire said. There are federal agents in the building. They've been here since last night. Nobody's telling us anything. The supervisor on nights said they restricted access to 3 hallways and told staff to document their patient interactions normally and not discuss the situation with media. Ben, listen to me. Your patients are going to be fine. Focus on them. Don't talk to anyone about what you found yesterday. The 14 patients, the Meridian codes. Save that for the investigators when they ask you, and they will ask you. Was I right to call you? Last night, I mean. She considered the question. Yes, she said. She could hear him breathing. Okay, he said, finally. Okay. At the federal building, Vance's office was a different space than the conference room she'd been in yesterday. Smaller, actual windows, the particular organized chaos of a room that had been the center of an active investigation for longer than its occupant would have preferred. Ray was there, and the younger woman whose name she still hadn't gotten, and a federal attorney named Howards who shook her hand with professional efficiency and explained the statement process in precise terms. She gave the statement. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Howards interrupted occasionally to clarify sequence or specify terminology, and twice asked her to slow down when she moved through clinical detail at a pace that outran the recording. She was thorough. She was accurate. She didn't editorialize and she didn't speculate. Where she was making a clinical judgment versus observing a fact, she said so explicitly because the distinction mattered, and she understood that her value in this room was precision. When she was done, Howards looked at his notes for a moment. You didn't mention the voice message, he said. You have the audio. I forwarded it to Vance last night. I want it in the statement. She added it, verbatim. 11 words. And you have no theory about the sender? Howards asked. I have questions, she said. Not theories. He nodded, made a note. Vance walked her out afterward, through the corridor, in the unhurried way of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. When they reached the lobby, he stopped and turned to face her. Griff is back in D.C., he said. He has counsel. They've already been in contact with our office. Preemptive, which tells us they know the warrant is live and they're positioning. What kind of positioning? The kind that tries to put distance between the executive and the operational decisions. I provided regulatory advisory services to Meridian. I wasn't involved in clinical decisions position. He was in that conference room. His counsel will argue he was there in his capacity as a stakeholder in a hospital-partner relationship, observing an internal HR matter. She looked at him. Does that work? Not if we can tie his presence to the order to terminate you and demonstrate that the termination was executed to obstruct an active investigation. A pause. Which is why your statement matters. Your account of Preem's words, Griff's presence, and the timing relative to your incident report gives us the framework for an obstruction charge that makes the HR argument untenable. She understood. Preem will deal. Preem's attorney called us at 8 this morning, Vance said. Before yours. She almost smiled. At noon, Congressman Farrow's office released a statement that appeared on every major newswire within 40 minutes. It did not name Hargrove specifically, not yet, that required coordination with the Justice Department, but it announced a federal investigation into what it described as systematic manipulation of clinical trial protocols at multiple medical facilities across 4 states, with patient outcomes deliberately falsified and cooperating personnel subject to workplace retaliation. It described the investigation as active and ongoing and referenced the involvement of a federal health enforcement division. It used the word accountability 4 times. Claire read it on her phone in the passenger seat of a car she wasn't driving. Vance had insisted on an agent taking her to and from the federal building, which was a form of protection she'd accepted without arguing because she was tired enough that arguing felt expensive. Her phone, which had been reasonably quiet for the past few hours, began receiving messages at a rate that made her put it face down on her knee. Ben, her former ER supervisor, who she hadn't heard from in 8 months. 2 nurses she'd worked with in her first year at Hargrove. A journalist whose name she recognized from the health desk of a national paper. 3 numbers she'd never seen. She looked at the window instead. The agent driving, a woman named Torres who had said about 12 words in the past 3 hours, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. You all right? Thinking, Claire said. About anything specific? 31 patients. Torres looked back at the road and didn't say anything else, which was the right call. The afternoon moved in a way that afternoons moved when events outpaced the people involved in them. The warrant execution at Hargrove produced by 2 p.m., a documented inventory of the Meridian partition that was transmitted to Farrow's committee and to the Justice Department simultaneously. Dr. Marcus Vell was formally arrested at 3:17 p.m. and transported to the federal building for processing. The charge for now was obstruction of a federal investigation, a holding charge, Vance explained, while the clinical fraud counts were being built into the indictment. Claire was in the federal building when Vell was brought in. She didn't plan to be. She'd been there for a follow-up on a documentation question when Torres had appeared in the hallway and said neutrally, "Vell's coming in the tone of someone noting a weather event. She saw him for approximately 4 seconds through the glass partition of the processing area. He was wearing the same jacket he'd been wearing in the research corridor last night, which meant he'd either been detained somewhere he couldn't change or someone had picked him up before he got home. His face had the particular flatness of a man who had decided, at some point between the research corridor and this lobby, that what he felt about the current situation was not something he was going to allow to show. Their eyes didn't meet. She wasn't sure she needed them to. Dana Marsh was taken into federal custody at 4:50 p.m. at an address in the south suburbs that was not her home address, which meant she'd been somewhere she didn't want to be found when they found her. Claire learned this from Vance, who called at 5:10 with the kind of flat factual brevity that characterized his communication when things were moving faster than he was comfortable narrating. "How is she?" Claire asked, and then wondered why she'd asked. "Her attorney is with her," Vance said. "Is she cooperating?" A pause. "I can't discuss that." Which probably meant yes. The public dimension of the collapse began at 6 p.m., which was when Hargrove Memorial's board of directors held an emergency session that lasted 40 minutes and produced a statement released simultaneously to local and national press. The statement announced the suspension of the hospital's COO, Gerald Preem, pending investigation, the establishment of an independent patient safety review committee, and the appointment of an interim administrative team to manage the facility during the federal inquiry. It did not mention Nexagen Biosciences. It did not mention Meridian. It expressed deep commitment to patient welfare and institutional transparency in language so carefully constructed that it communicated almost nothing except that the board had very good legal counsel. Claire read it and thought about 31 people. At 6:40, Farrow's office called her directly. Not the congressman, a senior aide named Prescott, who was polished and efficient and got to the point in the first 30 seconds. We're scheduling a closed briefing for committee members tomorrow morning at 9. We want your clinical account as part of the briefing package. Not the formal statement, a plain language explanation of what the Meridian protocols meant for patients at the bedside level. You want me to translate it, she said. I want committee members who are not clinicians to understand what was actually done to those patients, in terms they can communicate to their constituents. A pause. You were the person inside that building who saw it first. We need that perspective. I'll be there at 9, she said. She was at her kitchen table by 7:30, working on it. The plain language account, the translation from clinical to human, the sentence she'd have to find to describe what it meant for a person to come into a hospital, trusting that the people there were working in their interest, and to have that trust used against them in such a specific and deliberate way. She wrote for 2 hours. She deleted most of it and started over. The second draft was better because it was angrier, and she let the anger stay this time instead of editing it into professional neutrality because Prescott hadn't asked for professional neutrality. He'd asked for the bedside perspective. At 9:47, Vance called. Lawrence Griff, he said. Yes. He retained outside counsel at 7 this morning, as I told you. At 2 this afternoon, he filed a preemptive statement with our office asserting that his role at Nexagen was regulatory advisory and that all clinical decisions within the Meridian program were made by hospital-level personnel without his knowledge or direction. I know, she said. You told me. What I didn't tell you is that at 6:18 this evening, Griff's personal counsel contacted our office again, not to negotiate, to inform us that Griff has filed a separate civil action against Hargrove Memorial, Gerald Preem, and Marcus Vell, alleging that they misrepresented the Meridian program's compliance status to Nexagen and exposed the company to regulatory liability without Griff's knowledge. She let that sit for a moment. He's burning them, she said. He's creating a paper trail that positions Nexagen as a defrauded party rather than a co-conspirator. Can he make that work? If Preem and Vell cooperate with his narrative rather than contradicting it, yes. A pause. Which is why what happens in the next 24 hours matters significantly. If Preem or Vell deals with us before Griff's narrative gets established, we get the chain of command. If Griff's lawyers can hold that narrative long enough, he may be able to limit Nexagen's exposure to a civil settlement rather than criminal charges. She understood the mechanics. What do you need? Preem is the pivot point. He was in that conference room, he has direct documented contact with Griff, and he's already shown willingness to cooperate. The problem is that his attorney is also sophisticated, and he's not going to let Preem say anything useful without guarantees we're not in a position to finalize tonight. What about the other 6 hospitals? We're executing warrants simultaneously at 2 of the other 7 facilities. The other 5 are on a staggered schedule based on resource availability. She thought about the voice message. 11 words from a woman who had known about Marsh's transport, who had known where Marsh was, who had selected Claire specifically as the recipient of that information. The anonymous source, she said. The woman who sent me the photograph and the room number. Still unidentified. She knew about Marsh before your agents did. She knew which room he was in. She knew the transport was happening tonight. Yes. That means she has access to information inside the Meridian network, not just at Hargrove and at a level where she could see the operational decisions being made. A silence. We've considered that, Vance said. If she's inside Nexagen, then she's the most valuable witness we have and we need to find her before Griff's legal team does. His voice was steady, but she heard the weight under it. We're working on it. She looked at the draft on her table, the plain language account with its second draft that was better because it was angrier. Vance, she said. When Griff filed his preemptive statement this morning, who received it? Our office. Standard filing. Who else? A pause. It would have gone to the Oversight Committee's legal office as well, he said. Standard disclosure in active federal investigations. Farrow's committee. Yes. And Farrow's committee called me at 6 p.m. to schedule a 9 a.m. briefing. She sat forward. That's not a coincidence. That's Farrow establishing my testimony as part of the formal committee record before Griff's narrative can gain traction. Vance was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. And that's intentional. Is it going to work? That, he said, depends on what you say tomorrow morning. She looked at the draft. She picked up her pen and went back to work. At 11:15 p.m., her phone buzzed one more time. The same scrambled number. No voice message this time. No photograph. Just a text, 4 words, that arrived and sat on her screen with the particular stillness of something that required her to make a decision about what it meant before she decided what to do with it. He's not done yet. She stared at the 4 words for a long time. He's not done yet. Not Vel. Vel was in federal custody, not Preem. Preem was cooperating through his attorney, which meant he was contained by the process, even if not yet formally charged. The he and 4 words from a scrambled number at 11:15 at night pointed in one direction, and she'd known since Vance told her about the preemptive filing that Lawrence Griff was the most dangerous person in this situation, precisely because he was the most experienced at navigating it. She forwarded the message to Vance with no commentary. He called back in 4 minutes. I got it. What does it mean operationally? It means our source believes Griff has a move we haven't accounted for. A pause, the kind that carried actual weight. I've had agents on Griff since his preemptive filing. He's been in his D.C. office. Normal business activity on the surface. 3 calls to outside counsel, 2 to Nexigen's board chair. The board chair, she said. Owen Steele, 71, co-founder, holds approximately 38% of Nexigen's outstanding shares. He's been publicly uninvolved in the regulatory side of the business for the past 4 years. Publicly uninvolved. Yes. She looked at the text again. He's not done yet. Not they. He. Singular. Specific. Griff isn't moving alone, she said. Whatever he's planning, he needs Steele to execute it. Because Steele has the board relationships and Griff has the regulatory expertise, and separately neither of them can get far enough ahead of a federal investigation to matter. But together they can call an emergency board session, restructure Nexigen's subsidiary relationships, and create enough corporate distance between the parent company and the Meridian operation that by the time our indictment is fully constructed, we're chasing a shell. How long does that take? With a cooperative board and pre-drafted legal documentation, it can be executed in under 12 hours. She looked at the clock. 11:22 p.m. Vance, she said, what time does the market open? A pause. Then she heard him standing up, the specific acoustic of a chair and a body reorienting. 9:30. If Nexigen's restructuring involves moving assets between subsidiaries or dissolving Meridian's parent vehicle, it probably needs to happen before the market open or the securities implications become a separate problem. Which means they're moving tonight, he said, or they're already moving. He was on another call before she finished the sentence. She heard the switch, the brief silence, the different background, and she sat with her phone and her draft in the cold kitchen and waited. He called back in 9 minutes. Griff left his D.C. office at 10:50 p.m., Vance said. We lost visual when his vehicle entered a private parking structure. We're attempting to reacquire. What about Steele? Steele's primary residence is in Virginia. We're running activity checks now. A pause. Claire, I need you to think about whether your source could tell us where this meeting is happening. She looked at the scrambled number on her screen. The source had contacted her 4 times. Each contact had been initiated by the source, not by her. Each piece of information had been provided at the moment it was operationally relevant. The photograph when Marsh was being moved, the room number when time was tight, the voice message about Griff when his identification was the critical missing piece, and now this, 4 words that arrived at exactly the moment when Griff was in motion. This was not someone sending information randomly. This was someone who knew the timeline of events and was feeding her what she needed when she needed it. She typed one message to the scrambled number, "Where?" She didn't expect a fast response. It was 11:26 and she was asking someone who had, until now, controlled all the timing to give her information on demand. The response came in 40 seconds. An address, a building name, a floor number, and then below that a single additional line, "I'm already here, room 1140. Come alone or don't come, your choice." She read it 3 times. Then she called Vance back. "I have a location." She gave it to him. All of it. The address, the building, the floor, the room number. And the last line. The silence on the other end was the particular silence of a man deciding between 2 things he didn't fully like. She said, "Come alone." I heard what she said. If she's inside Nexogen and she's already at that location, she may have information that could collapse Griff's restructuring entirely. But if Griff knows she's there, then she's in danger, Claire said. Which is why she's asking me to come instead of just calling you directly. She could have called us directly at any point in this process. And she didn't, which means she doesn't trust federal process to move fast enough, or she has a reason for choosing me specifically that goes beyond operational necessity. She was already moving toward her coat. "Vance, send your agents to the building. Keep them out of that room until I call you. 15 minutes. Claire, 15 minutes, she said. If I don't call you in 15 minutes, send everyone. She made it to the building in 11 minutes, which required driving in a way she normally didn't, and parking in a way that was technically creative. The building was a corporate tower in the financial district, the kind of address that housed law firms and investment offices, and the satellite operations of companies whose primary existence was elsewhere. The lobby was after hours staffed by a single security guard who looked up when she walked in. She gave the room number. She said she was expected. The guard called up, listened, and waved her through with the incurious efficiency of someone who had been told to let her pass and wasn't being paid to wonder about it. 11th floor. The elevator was fast and silent and opened onto a corridor that was lit at half level, the kind of after-hours dimming that happened automatically in buildings where nobody expected human beings at this hour. Room 1140 was at the end of the corridor. She knocked once. "It's open," said the voice from the scrambler. Except without the scrambler now. Just a voice. Female. Older than she'd estimated. Tired in the specific way of someone who had been tired for a long time and had learned to work inside it. She opened the door. The woman sitting at the conference table was 63, maybe 65. White hair cut practically, the kind of clothes that read as professional without trying to signal anything. She had a laptop open in front of her, 2 folders on the table, and a cup of coffee that had probably been hot a while ago. She looked at Claire with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had spent considerable time deciding whether to trust her and had arrived at a provisional yes. "Sit down," the woman said. Claire sat. "My name is Miriam Osgood," the woman said. "I was the chief compliance officer of Nexogen Biosciences for 9 years. I resigned 14 months ago." 14 months ago. The same month the federal investigation opened. "You're the one who opened the Stillwater investigation," Claire said. "I'm the one who provided the initial documentation to the federal oversight body that opened it. Yes." She looked at her coffee. "I'd been compiling it for 8 months before that. I needed to be sure what I had was complete enough to be useful before I handed it over. In retrospect, I waited too long. The program had already expanded to 4 hospitals by the time I resigned. Now it's 7. Now it's 7, she said. And Lawrence Griff is 2 floors above us right now, in a meeting with Owen Steele and 4 members of Nexogen's board, executing a restructuring that's been pre-drafted for exactly this contingency." She opened the top folder. "I wrote the contingency plan myself. In 2019, when the Meridian program was first being structured, Griff asked me to prepare a set of legal fire breaks, his word, for scenarios in which the program attracted regulatory attention. I prepared them. And then I watched what the program actually was, and I left." Claire looked at the folder. "What does the restructuring do?" "It dissolves Meridian Clinical Partners as a subsidiary and transfers its operational assets, contracts, data, financial instruments, to 2 newly created entities that don't have Nexogen's name anywhere in their documentation. The patient records partition is the key piece. If those records are transferred to a new entity before your federal warrant can be amended to cover the new entities, The chain of custody becomes legally contested. How long does the transfer take to execute? With pre-drafted documentation and cooperative board signatures, 40 minutes. She looked at the clock on the wall. They've been in that room for 22 minutes. 18 minutes. Claire called Vance. He answered before the first ring finished. Talk to me. Nexogen is executing the restructuring right now. 11th floor of this building. Griff, Steele, and board members. The partition transfer is the critical piece. You need to freeze the Meridian partition's data now before the transfer executes. We need a separate warrant amendment to Vance. You have a federal warrant covering the Meridian Clinical Partners partition as it currently exists. If the entity is dissolved and the data moves to a new entity in the next 18 minutes, your warrant doesn't follow it automatically. You know that. A silence that lasted 4 seconds. I need a federal judge. You need a federal judge in 18 minutes. She heard him already moving. She looked at Miriam Osgood. You timed this, she said. You knew when the meeting was scheduled. You've been watching Griff's movements. I have contacts inside Nexogen who still share information with me. She closed the folder. I knew about the meeting at 4 this afternoon. I needed someone who could get federal agents to this building legally and urgently, but I couldn't contact them directly without exposing my identity and giving Griff's lawyers grounds to challenge my credibility as a witness. So you needed someone who had already made contact with the investigation, someone who had standing, someone who had spent the past 24 hours building exactly the kind of documented relationship with the federal investigation that would make one phone call from her move people quickly. She looked at Claire steadily. I've been watching what you did inside that hospital, the incident report, the partition index. Marsh. A pause. I needed someone they'd already learned to listen to. The strange thing about that, Claire thought, was that 48 hours ago, nobody at Hargrove Memorial Hospital had been listening to her at all. She sat in that room with Miriam Osgood and her pre-dawn coffee and her 14 months of careful, costly waiting, and she watched the clock, and 11 minutes later Vance called back. Emergency warrant amendment, he said. Federal judge signed 7 minutes ago. The partition is frozen as of now, so any transfer attempt will hit a legal block in the federal system. We have agents moving into that building. 12 minutes later, the meeting on the 13th floor of that building stopped being a private corporate restructuring and became a federal crime scene. She wasn't in the room when it happened. She was still on the 11th floor with Miriam Osgood, who received the news with the particular stillness of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and was only beginning to understand what putting it down felt like. Is it enough? Miriam asked. Vance says the frozen partition plus your documentation plus Preem's cooperation gives them a complete chain. Claire looked at her. You're going to have to testify. I know. It won't be easy. I know that too. She looked at her hands on the table. I should have moved sooner. I told myself I needed more documentation, that the evidence had to be airtight. A pause. People died while I was making sure my evidence was airtight. Claire didn't offer her absolution. She wasn't qualified to give it, and Miriam hadn't asked for it. What she said instead was, you moved. That's what matters now. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough, and Miriam knew it wasn't enough. And they sat with that knowledge in the room without trying to talk around it, because some things didn't benefit from being smoothed over. Lawrence Griff was taken into federal custody at 12:47 a.m. Owen Steele was detained at the same location. The 4 board members were separated and transported to different federal facilities for individual processing, which was standard procedure and which had the practical effect of preventing them from coordinating their accounts before investigators had a chance to speak to each of them independently. Claire learned this from Vance in a series of brief calls between 1 and 2 in the morning. She was in her car. Miriam Osgood was being transported separately to a secure location where she would begin the formal process of providing her testimony to the federal investigation. They had exchanged numbers, real ones, not scrambled. At 2:14 a.m., sitting in her car outside her apartment building, too tired to go upstairs and too awake to not be sitting somewhere, she looked at the city around her and thought about 31 people. Then she went upstairs and slept. The congressional briefing at 9 a.m. was not what she'd imagined, and she'd known better than to imagine it too specifically. The committee room held 14 members and their staff, plus federal investigators and a department representative whose title was long and whose function appeared to be institutional liability management. Farrow ran it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been in rooms like this a long time and knew that clarity was more valuable than theater. She spoke for 40 minutes. She used the draft she'd written and rewritten, the plain language account, the translation from clinical to human. She explained what a treatment designation meant and how it was supposed to work. She explained what it meant for a patient to receive a compound without their knowledge. She explained the bruise on Elliot Marsh's arm and the oxygen configuration on the gurney rail and the 5-point difference in a saturation reading that most people would blink past. She explained what it felt like to be the person in the room who noticed and to have every institutional mechanism designed to make sure noticing didn't lead anywhere. One of the committee members, a woman from Ohio whose name Claire didn't retain, leaned forward at the end and asked, "Why didn't you leave? When they walked you through that emergency room, why didn't you just take the termination and go?" Claire considered the question. "Because I knew what I'd seen," she said, "and because the only thing more expensive than fighting it was pretending I hadn't." The room was quiet for a moment. Farrow nodded once, wrote something, and moved to the next item. The weeks that followed were not a clean resolution. Nothing about it was clean. The federal indictment against Lawrence Griff and Owen Steele was filed 31 days after the night in that parking garage, and it was 47 pages long, and the charges included conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and in the cases of 3 Nexagen executives who had direct operational oversight of the compound protocols, charges that carried the specific weight of outcomes, of 31 deaths across Hargrove alone and 109 across all 7 hospitals, a number that emerged from the expanded investigation with the slow, terrible clarity of something that had always been there waiting to be counted. Gerald Preem entered a cooperation agreement in the second week. He provided documented evidence of Griff's direct involvement in the decision to terminate Claire, framing it in writing as a threat containment measure. His words, recorded and preserved, which gave the obstruction charge a specificity that Griff's lawyers spent considerable effort trying to contest and could not. Dr. Marcus Vell's medical license was suspended by the state licensing board pending investigation, a process that took longer than it should have, because these processes always did, but which moved faster than it might have because Ben, the nurse who had looked at his chart rather than meet her eyes, provided a detailed account of documentation practices he had observed and chosen not to report over the period of 18 months. He gave that account voluntarily and without being compelled, and it cost him something visible. She saw it in his face when they spoke, and she thought that cost was probably appropriate and that he probably thought so too. Dana Marsh cooperated. Dana's cooperation was complicated by the fact that her role had been primarily facilitative. She'd deflected internal concerns, she'd managed information flow on the floor, she'd been a paid advisory contact for Meridian. Her attorney negotiated a plea arrangement that resulted in the surrender of her nursing license and a substantial financial penalty. She did not serve jail time. Claire had opinions about that which she kept to herself, mostly because the system's imperfections were not something she'd been appointed to adjudicate. Elliot Marsh recovered. It took 6 weeks, and the process was not smooth. There were respiratory complications from the extended ventilator period, a secondary infection that required targeted treatment, and a cognitive fogginess in the early weeks that resolved more slowly than anyone wanted. She visited him once, at 3 weeks post-extubation, at the facility where he was recovering outside the Hargrove system entirely. He was sitting up and had color in his face, and he shook her hand with both of his and didn't say anything for a moment. "You found me in a hallway," he said finally. "You were hard to miss," she said. "You were the one on the gurney." He laughed, which was the wrong thing for his still recovering lungs, and they both winced, and it was the most human moment she'd had in weeks. Robert Halden testified before Farrow's committee in week 3. She watched the hearing on a live stream from her kitchen on the laptop she'd bought to replace the one she'd been using on borrowed federal equipment. He was composed and precise and spoke about what he'd found inside the Nexagen Meridian network with the methodical authority of someone who had spent 8 months building toward exactly this room. Near the end of the hearing, a committee member asked him about his time at Hargrove, specifically about the morning he'd been discharged. "There was a nurse," he said. "She came in before her shift started. She read my chart like it was a puzzle she was going to solve. Not because anyone asked her to, because the numbers didn't add up, and she wasn't the kind of person who let numbers not add up. The committee member asked if that was significant. It meant I was still alive, Halden said. So yes. She closed the laptop, sat for a moment. Outside her window, December had arrived with the particular efficiency of Colorado winters, cold that had weight and commitment, the mountains white above the valley, the city below doing what cities did with neither sentiment nor malice. She'd been living in this apartment for 4 years without fully occupying it. She was aware of that. The boxes in the second closet, the walls with their rental white paint, the sense of a person who had arranged their life around a job that was no longer there. Hargrove Memorial had offered her reinstatement. The offer had come through HR, on institutional letterhead, 4 weeks after the initial indictment. Full reinstatement at her previous level, back pay for the period of unlawful termination, a formal written apology from the interim administration. She'd read the letter twice. She'd left it on her kitchen table for 3 days. Then she'd written back, politely, without anger, in the professional register of someone who was closing a door carefully rather than slamming it, and declined. Not because she was angry, not because she couldn't have gone back and done the job. She could have. She was good at it, and she knew it. But there are things you understand about yourself that you didn't understand before. And one of them, when she examined it honestly, was that she had been using the ordinary machinery of a hospital job to stay small in a way that felt like safety. She'd left a different life because a mission went wrong and people got hurt, and she had carried the specific weight of that for years in the way of someone who believes the weight is what they deserve. Ravenwood, Hargrove, had been a place where she could be useful and contained simultaneously, where her skills had a narrow channel and the channel had walls. She didn't need the walls anymore. Vance called on a Tuesday morning in December with his characteristic directness. There's a position, Federal Health Enforcement Division, specialized unit that investigates exactly what happened at Hargrove, clinical fraud, patient safety violations inside research programs, documentation manipulation. The unit needs someone who understands clinical systems from the inside, who can walk into a hospital and read a chart the way you read Halden's chart that morning. She was quiet for a moment. It's not a nursing position, she said. No, it's an investigator position. You'd work alongside federal agents and clinical consultants. The nursing background is the qualification. It's why we want you. Has Miriam Osgood been interviewed for anything like this? A pause. We've spoken with her. Her role will likely be more advisory. She has the Nexagen institutional knowledge we need for the broader case. But the unit I'm describing is operational. It needs someone who can work in the field. She looked at the boxes in her second closet. The other 6 hospitals, she said, beyond Hargrove. 5 now. 2 have been processed. The other 5. There are patients in those facilities right now on Meridian protocols that haven't been reviewed yet. That's correct. That's where I'd start, she said. That's where we'd want you to start, Vance said. The Griff trial began 7 months after the night in the parking structure. She testified on the 4th day, not as the primary witness, but as the clinical foundation for the documentation fraud charges. The person who could stand in front of a jury and explain in plain terms what the altered records meant and how she'd identified them, and what the practical consequence was for a patient named Robert Halden, who had come into a hospital with a cardiac presentation and left with a compound in his system that didn't belong there. She was on the stand for 3 hours. Griff's defense attorney was skilled and prepared and spent considerable time trying to establish that Claire's clinical observations were the subjective interpretations of a nurse who had been, as he put it, predisposed toward finding problems at Hargrove given her history of filing complaints. He asked about her incident reports. He asked about her professional relationship with the administration. He asked, at one point, whether she considered herself a particularly detail-oriented person, in the particular tone of someone trying to make detail orientation sound like a pathology. She answered every question with the same measured clarity she'd been using in difficult rooms for years now. When he was done, the federal prosecutor stood up and asked her one question. Ms. Whitmore, when you observed Robert Halden's oxygen saturation at 6:53 in the morning on the day in question, what did you do? I put him on supplemental oxygen, she said. And then I called the attending because the numbers didn't match and a patient needed someone to pay attention. That's all? That's all? The jury took 4 days. Griff was convicted on 11 of 14 counts, including conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud at the federal level, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 2 counts related to the knowing facilitation of protocols that resulted in patient deaths. Owen Steele was convicted on 6 counts in a separate proceeding 3 weeks later. Between them, the sentencing recommendations from the federal prosecutors totaled more than 30 years of combined custodial exposure, and while neither man would serve his full recommended term, the appeals process was a guarantee of that. The convictions were clean, and they were documented, and they were public, and they were permanent. She was not in the courtroom for the verdicts. She was in a hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, not as a patient and not as an employee. As the lead investigator on a federal health enforcement team reviewing documentation, anomalies at a facility with suspected meridian adjacencies. She learned about the verdict from Vance via text. 3 words. Both counts confirmed. She read it in a hospital corridor that smelled like every hospital corridor she'd ever been in, and she held it for a moment, and then she went back to work. The woman she'd been before Hargrove had been organized around a version of quiet that was really closer to absence. She'd built her life small on purpose. Small apartment, narrow job, the controlled usefulness of someone who had decided that contained was the same as safe. She hadn't been wrong, exactly. She'd been managing something real. But managing it and living inside it were not the same, and somewhere between the parking structure and the federal building and the corridor on the 3rd floor of a hospital where a man was being moved without his consent, she had stopped managing it and started doing something else instead. She didn't have a word for the something else that felt accurate enough to use. She knew what it felt like in practice. It felt like reading a chart at 6:50 in the morning and not being able to look away. It felt like filing a report when every institutional signal told you the report would go nowhere. It felt like staying in a hallway when the sensible thing was to leave. It felt, when she examined it honestly, like herself. Elliot Marsh sent her a message in January, not from a recovery facility, but from home, which was itself the message. He attached a single document, a draft op-ed he'd written for a national medical journal, about what the Meridian protocols had meant from the inside, about the institutional mechanisms that had allowed it to continue for as long as it had, about the question of what clinical settings owed their patients in terms of honest accounting. Near the end, he wrote about a morning in November when he had been sedated and intubated and moving through a hospital corridor towards something he had no ability to resist, and about a nurse who had come around a corner and stood between him and whatever was on the other side of it. He'd written, "She wasn't armed, she wasn't authorized. She had her nursing instincts and a set of observations she refused to let anyone tell her didn't matter. That was enough." In the end, it was exactly enough. She read it standing at her kitchen window with the January light coming in at an angle that made the mountains look very close. She reread the last 2 sentences 3 times. Then she wrote back, "Publish it." She thought about the thing people said, the thing she'd heard in different forms, in different contexts throughout her life, about how the quiet ones were dangerous, how the underestimated ones were worth watching, how the person everyone dismissed was sometimes the person who changed everything. She'd always found that narrative a little too convenient. Life wasn't usually structured that way. Usually the people who were dismissed stayed dismissed, and the people in the conference rooms kept their hands flat on the tables, and the files in the partitions stayed in the partitions. What had changed was not a mechanism, it was accumulation. It was one nurse who read a chart on a morning when she could have skimmed it. One incident report submitted before a termination could make it irrelevant. One number, 5 points, a saturation reading, the distance between 98 and 93, that she refused to accept as a rounding error. The accumulation of small, stubborn refusals to let things go that shouldn't be let go. That was the only thing that had changed. It was not dramatic. It was not a superpower. It was the willingness to be the person who stayed with the numbers when everyone around her had decided the numbers were someone else's problem. In February, she moved to a new apartment. It took 4 hours, partly because she didn't own much, and partly because she finally opened the boxes in the second closet and sorted through what was in them. Most of it went to donation. Some of it, a photograph, a textbook with handwritten margin notes, a Littmann stethoscope that was not the one she'd left in her Hargrove locker, but an older one from a different chapter, she kept. The new apartment had walls she was going to paint. She'd already decided the color. She'd made the decision the way she made most decisions now. She looked at what she actually wanted rather than at what was easiest to maintain, and she went from there. The boxes stayed empty this time. She was not the nurse who had been fired in front of a full emergency room. She was not the problem employee who asked too many questions. She was not the woman who had been walked out of a building by security while her colleagues looked at their charts and said nothing. She was the person who had read a chart at 6:50 in the morning because the numbers didn't add up and had not looked away, and had kept not looking away through everything that followed, and who understood now that this was not a special skill and not a heroic trait and not something that required a particular history or a particular call sign or a particular set of experiences from a life before hospitals. It required only the decision to take what you saw seriously, to trust that the thing you noticed in a dim room at the beginning of a shift, before anyone else arrived, before the day got loud enough to drown it out, that thing was real, that it mattered, that the gap between what the numbers said and what you were seeing with your own eyes was not your imagination and not your problem, and not the kind of thing you let go of because someone in a better office told you to. She had paid for that decision. She would pay for it again. She would make it again without hesitation. Outside her new window, Salt Lake City did what it always did. Went about its business, indifferent and continuous and full of people who were, at this moment, in hospitals, waiting for results, trusting the paperwork, trusting that the person who picked up their chart had actually read it. She thought about those people sometimes. She thought about them when she walked into a new hospital on a federal review and felt the particular atmosphere of an institution that had decided efficiency was more important than attention. She thought about them when she found a number that didn't sequence correctly, a timestamp that didn't add up, a billing code that pointed to a partition no one was supposed to open. She thought about them the way she'd thought about Robert Halden at 6:50 in the morning, not as an abstraction, not as a statistic, but as a person in a bed who had come into a building and trusted it. She picked up the chart. She always picked up the chart. That was where it started. That was where it had always started. Not with resources or authority or institutional support, none of which she'd had, but with one person in a room deciding that what she saw was worth the cost of seeing it clearly. That was the only thing nobody could terminate.